We continue now at the top of Daf Ayin Chesam and Beis Meseches Menachos. This is Menachos Daf 78b. The Mishnah says, "Hashochet asatoda lifnim." If one slaughters the carbon toda inside of the courtyard of the Beis Hamikdash, inside of the Azara, v'la'achma chutz lachom, and its bread is outside of the wall. The Gemara will discuss which wall we're referring to over here. So lo kidash alechem. In that situation, the bread is not going to be sanctified. Shachta shelo karmu paneh b'tanur. If he slaughters it before the surface of the bread is crusted in the oven, ve'afilu karmu kulan chutz me'echon mehen, and even if all of the loaves were crusted except for one of them, lo kidash halechem, the bread is not sanctified. And the Gemara says, "My chutz lechoma." What does it mean, chutz lechoma? What does the Mishnah mean when it says that the lechem is outside of the wall? Rabbi Yochanan says, "Chutz lechomas beis pagi." It's outside of the chomas beis pagi. That is the wall of beis pagi. The wall of beis pagi is the outermost wall surrounding the city of Yerushalayim. Reish Lakish says, "Chutz lechomas ha'azar." The reference in the Mishnah, it just means that it's outside the walls of the Azar of the Beis Hamikdash. And the Gemara continues and elaborates. Reish Lakish says, "Chutz lechomas ha'azara." Again, he says, even if the bread is merely outside the walls of the Azara, it's not going to be sanctified. That's because ba'inon al b'samach. When it says in the pasuk al, that means it has to be nearby. The pasuk says, "V'hikriv al zevach hatoda chalos matzos." We understand that the bread needs to be nearby. It must be in the Azara. For Rabbi Yochanan says, "Chutz lechomas beis pagi," outside of the walls of beis pagi. Avol chutz li Azara kadosh. He says that if it's outside of the Azara, it still will be sanctified. V'lo ba'inon al b'samach, and there is no requirement that it says al in the pasuk that means there has to be proximity. But the Gemara continues and asks, "Va'ifligu ba chada zimna." But this machlokus between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, we already find such a machlokus one time. The Tanan, as we learned in a Mishnah, and this is a Mishnah in Meseches Psachim, Hashochet es haPesach al hachametz. If one slaughters the carbon Pesach over chametz, and the meaning of that is that he has chametz in his possession at the time that he offers the carbon Pesach, so he's shochet es haPesach al hachametz over below saseh. In such a situation, he is going to be in violation of a negative commandment. Rabbi Yehuda says, "Af hatamid." This is true even with regards to the carbon tamid. Rabbi Yehuda holds that if one slaughters the afternoon carbon tamid on the 14th of Nisan while in the possession of chametz, there's also going to be a violation of this same commandment. And the Gemara continues, V'yamar Reish Lakish, and Reish Lakish says, Liola meino chayiv, there's not going to be any liability in this situation, again, where one slaughters the carbon Pesach with chametz, ad shi'eh ola shochet, ola zorek, ola echon mimnei chabura, unless either the one slaughtering the carbon, or the one throwing the blood of the carbon, or one of the members of the group that owns the carbon, they have to have the chametz, and imo ba'azara. Furthermore, that chametz has to be with him in the Azara, in the courtyard of the Beis Hamikdash. Rabbi Yochanan says, "Afal pi she'ein imo ba'azara," even though the chametz is not with him in the Azar of the Beis Hamikdash, still there is going to be a liability. And this also seems to be the exact same machlokus between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. The pasuk says, "Lo sizbach al chametz dam zivchi." It says al chametz, and so again, Reish Lakish understands al means besamach; it has to be nearby, and Rabbi Yochanan doesn't have any such requirement. And the Gemara continues and answers, "Tzricha," it's necessary, meaning it's necessary to have the machlokus Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan both in this case of the carbon Pesach, and also in our case by the lechem, by the bread of the carbon toda. Di itmar ba'ahi, because if we only had that case, meaning if we only had the machlokus by the slaughtering of the carbon Pesach, ba'ahi kamer Rabbi Yochanan, so we'd say over there, Rabbi Yochanan says that it doesn't need to be in the Azara. The reason is because anywhere the chametz is, it is still in its prohibited state, and so therefore the location doesn't matter. But in terms of sanctifying the bread, I might say that he admits to Reish Lakish, the isay b'fnim kadosh, that if it's inside the Azara, then it's kadosh, and avroi lo kadosh, but if it's outside the Azara, it's not kadosh. And likewise, the Gemara continues, v'yitmar b'ha. Now, if the machlokes, if it was only stated in this case, meaning in the case of the toda bread, so then I would say b'ha kamer Reish Lakish. I would say that only in this case, the word al means proximity; it has to be nearby in order to be kadosh. Aval b'ha chema moda leila Rabbi Yochanan. But I might say in the case of the carbon Pesach, he admits to Rabbi Yochanan, and so therefore tzricha, that's why it's necessary to have the machlokas in both situations. And the Gemara continues, Tanya Kavasi to Rabbi Yochanan, we have a brisa in accordance with Rabbi Yochanan that it does not need actual proximity. Hashochet hatoda lifnim, if one slaughters the carbon toda inside, v'lachma chutz l'chomas beis pagi, it says explicitly over here, the bread is outside the wall of beis pagi, lo kadosh halechem, so then the bread is not going to be sanctified. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Shachta, if he slaughters the carbon toda, ad shelo karmu poneh, if he slaughters it before the surface of the bread is crusted betanur in the oven, so then it's not going to be kadosh. And the Gemara says, Menohani mili, from where do we know this? The Tanu Rabbanon, because the sages taught in the Braisa. The pasuk says, Al chalos lechem chometz yakriv karbono al zevach. What does this pasuk teach us? The translation of the pasuk is, with loaves of leavened bread, he shall bring his offering, again with the carbon toda. And Melamid, this teaches, Shein halechem kadosh aleim kein karmu paneha betanur. It teaches us that the bread is not sanctified unless the surface of the bread has become crusted inside of the oven. The idea over here is that a baked dough is not called a loaf until the crust has formed on it. And so therefore, again, we see in this pasuk, it says, Al chalos lechem chametz, loaves of lechem chametz, and so therefore it has to be karmu paneh betanur. And then the pasuk says, Yakriv karbono, again the pasuk says, Yakriv karbono al zevach, that he's going to bring his offering with the sacrifice of the carbon toda. Milamed, that teaches, She'ein halechem kadosh, Ella b'shchitas hazevach. That teaches that the lechem is only going to be kadosh with the shchitas hazevach, with the actual slaughter of the animal sacrifice. And then the pasuk says zevach todas. It says zevach todas. What does that teach us? Malamed, that teaches shim shachat shalo lishman. That let's say he slaughters the carbon toda, but he doesn't do it lishman. He doesn't do it for its own sake. So then lo kiddush alechem. So then the bread is not sanctified. And the Gemara continues. Tanu Rabbanan, the sages taught in a brayso yotzin b'matzah. No, the halacha is that one can fulfill his obligation. This is talking about matzah and Pesach with a partially baked matzah. Uvematzah ha'asuya be'ilfis, and also with a matzah that was made in a pan. The Gemara continues and asks, my matzah, no, what exactly does it mean, a partially baked matzah? Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel. Rav Yehuda says, that Shmuel says, Kol shaporsa vein chutin nimshachin heimen. It means as long as the matzah, if one breaks it apart, it breaks apart cleanly, without strands of dough pulling from it, so then as long as that is the situation, one is going to fulfill his obligation. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rava says, V'chein le'inyan lachmei toda. The same is true with regards to the lachmei toda, as long as they're sufficiently baked, that again they break apart in that clean way, so then that is considered to be sufficient, a sufficient amount of baking, that they are acceptable. And the Gemara says, Pshita, well, isn't that obvious? Hacha lechem ksiv, over here, it's written the word bread, meaning regarding the toad that says the word bread, it says lechem. V'hacha lechem ksiv, and also over here, meaning with regards to the matzah of Pesach, it says the word bread, and so the definition should be exactly the same. And so therefore, what exactly is Rava teaching us? Of course, the halach is the same by lachmei toda as it is by the matzah on Pesach. And the Gemara continues and answers, Ma'u detema, what might you have said? Echad amar achmana. The pasuk says echad. It says in the pasuk that he's going to offer from one of each of the bread is going to be a truma la Hashem. That's the one that is given to the Kohen. And we learned from that earlier, shelo yitol paras, that one is not allowed to take a broken loaf as the truma. It has to be a whole loaf. And so therefore, v'hakiman defrisa damya. Now, when it comes to a partially baked loaf of bread, maybe it's considered like it's all broken, meaning to say that baking it only to the point where it breaks cleanly is not sufficient. Maybe it actually has to be baked more in the situation of the lachmei toda. Maybe that would be excluded because of echad. That's considered to be a problem of parus. And so kamash malan, that's what Rav is teaching us, that as long as it's able to break cleanly, as long as it meets that requirement, which would be good in terms of matzah and Pesach, so that's going to be good for the lachmei toda as well. And the Gemara continues, Itmar, it was stated, Toda sheshachta al shmonim chalos. Let's say you have a carbon toda and it was slaughtered over 80 loaves instead of 40 loaves. Chizkiya Amar, so what happens in this situation? Chizkiya Amar, Chizkiya says, Kodshu arboi mitoch shmonim. What happens is 40 of the 80 loaves become consecrated. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Rabbi Yochanan says, Lo kodshu arboi mitoch shmonim. That's not the case. We don't say that 40 of the 80 loaves become consecrated. Rather, none of them become consecrated. And Rashi Ksav Yad explains, Kodshula arboi mitoch shmonim, 40 of the 80 become consecrated. According to that point of view, V'kulan shmonim yochlu b'kedusha liyom v'layla, all 80 will then have to be eaten with that sanctity for a day and a night. We don't know which 40 of the 80. Tahalo yadi, hay arboi arboim kodshi. We don't know which 40 became to sanctified. And then Rabbi Yochanan says, Lo kodshu. Rabbi Yochanan says it's not true. We don't say 40 of the 80 become kadosh. Tahalo efshar diyikdushu shmonim. It can't be that 80 become kadosh. Talo boyel arboim, because only 40 are needed. V'lo yotzi yadei nidro, and so therefore the neder is not going to be fulfilled. The oath will not be fulfilled. Delo tavsibu kedusha, because the kedusha will not take effect. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rabbi Zeira says, Hakol modim, everybody admits, everybody agrees, Heichad de Omar, if the person actually said, Likdashu arboim mitoch shmonim, that 40 of the 80 should be kadosh, so then kadshu, so then certainly 40 of the 80 will in fact become kadosh. And al yikdashu arboim el imkein yikdashu shmonim, let's say he says 40 should not become holy unless all 80 become holy, so then lo kitshu, so then they're not going to become holy. In both of those scenarios, there is no machlokas. Ki pligi b'stama. Now, when is there a machlokas? That's just if the person specified nothing. He didn't say anything about the extra 40 loaves. Mar savar lachrayas kamachavin. One holds, meaning Chizkiah holds, that we assume that the 40 extra loaves are essentially achrayas. They're like a guarantee. Let's say something happens to the first 40, they become lost, they become disqualified. He just wants them as achrayas, and that's why Chizkiah says 40 of the 80 become kadosh. But Umar savar, but the other opinion holds, Rabbi Yochanan holds l'karban gadol kamachavin, that actually his kavanah was, his intention was that it's l'karban gadol. He wanted to make an even greater, an even larger offering of 80 loaves, but since it's not allowed to be larger than the required amount, so therefore the kedusha, the consecration, doesn't take effect whatsoever, according to Rabbi Yochanan. And the Gemara continues, Abaya Amar, Abaya says, the kuli alma liachrayas kamachavin. Everybody agrees, liachrayas kamachavin. Now here we have a girsa change according to the Rashi, Ksaviyad, according to also Rashi in general. According to Rashi, the proper girsa over here is not la'achrayis, but rather l'karban gadol kamachavin. So again, according to Abaya, everybody agrees l'karban gadol kamachavin. Everybody agrees, really he's having in mind l'karban gadol. He wants to actually sanctify the 80, which really should be problematic. Uvechli shares mekajin shlomidas kamiflagi. And the machlokas over here actually is whether klei shares, whether service vessels of the Beis HaMikdash, are the able to consecrate sacrificial items even without the owner's intent. That's what they're arguing about. It's a situation of a machlokas about kavana. Mar savar klisharis mekadesh shalom midas. One holds that a klisharis is able to be mekadesh even shalom midas. That's the opinion of Chizkiah. And so therefore, even though the person did not intend for 40 loaves to be sanctified, he was actually thinking he wanted 80 loaves to be sanctified, which really technically should not be good, but still automatically the klisharis is able to be mekadesh the 40 loaves, and that's why again 40 of the 80 are going to have kedusha. We can't identify which 40, but they will have that kedusha. Umar Savar, and the other opinion holds, meaning Rabbi Yochanan holds, klishares ein mekadin shalom midas. The klishares are not mekadesh shalom midas, and so therefore again, if we're going to say that everybody agrees l'karban gadol kamachavin, there's going to be no kedusha in this situation. And the Gemara continues with another approach. Rav Papa Amar, Rav Papa says, the kuli alm klishares mekadin shalom midas. Everybody agrees that actually wouldn't be an issue. Klishares am mekadesh shalom midas v'hacha besakin kamiflagi. But here they argue about the slaughtering, literally the slaughtering of the knife. That's the machlokas, and it means as follows: Mar savar sakin mekadeshes kechlisharis. One holds, meaning Chizkiah holds, that the knife, it consecrates the sacrificial items like any other klisharis, meaning to say you don't need to have any intention. According to Rapap, again, everybody agrees klisharis is mekadesh shalom midas, and that's true with the knife that's slaughtering the animal as well. You don't need to have any intention; it's just like a klisharis. But Umar Savar, but Rabbi Yochanan holds sakin with regards to the knife. Kaven de lesle toch, since the knife, it has no inside, it's not a receptacle. So eina mekadesh as klisharis, it's not mekadesh like a klisharis. It has to have the proper intent, and that's why over here there's going to be no kedusha. And the Gemara continues: V'ika di'aminar, there are those that say they have a slightly different version of Rav Papa. Rav Papa says, "Tekuli alma klishares ein mekadeshin ela midas." Everybody agrees that klishares are only mekadesh midas, and so therefore, really klishares, if it was klishares, it would not be able to be mekadesh. But the other way around, v'hacha besakin kamiflagi. Here they're arguing by the knife. Mar savar sakin alima michlishares. Chizkiah holds that the sakin actually is superior; it's stronger than klishares. Di'afagav deles leitoch mikdasha. Because how do we see that it's superior? It's able to consecrate even without an interior, and since it's superior in that regard, so therefore it's actually stronger in the other regard as well. It's able to be mekadesh even shalom midas. Umar Savar, but Rabbi Yochanan holds sakin lo alim alei mi klishares, that the knife is not stronger than other klishares, and so therefore without owner's intent, there's going to be no sanctification. And Rashi Ksaviyad explains, Chizkiah Savar, Chizkiah holds, Hai da'amar shmonim, when the person says 80 lachrayas achav, and that's just for achrayas, it's a guarantee. Shem yovdu har boim, that if the 40 should be lost. Yishtayru harboim. There'll be 40 others. Hilkach lo yadaite elal harboim v'kachi. Therefore, his intention was for 40, and it is kadosh. And the carbon gadol means lishmonim. The person actually had intention to sanctify 80. V'halo efsher. That of course is impossible. Hilkach lo tafsibu kedusha klal v'lo yatsi yadei nidra. Therefore, there's no kedusha. There's no neder that is fulfilled. B'chli shares mekadjon shalom midas kamiflagi. By kli shares are they mekadesh shalom midas u'dekuliyam the carbon gadol ichavin. Again, as we said, according to this approach, everybody agrees the carbon gadol. It should be problematic unless we say it's mekadjon shalom midas. Chizkiya savar mekadjon esaroy lam shalom midas. You don't need intention according to Chizkiya. Rabbi Yochanan savar sakin. Rabbi Yochanan holds a knife shemekadesh stam hachalos b'shchitas hatoda. Again, it's through the slaughter of the toda that the loaves are actually sanctified. Mekadesh el midas ish. There you do need das. V'afilu masharoy lahem v'das ish al shmonim. Since he's thinking about 80, hilkach lo kadshi. Therefore, it is not sanctified. V'chizkiya savar sakin mekadesh kishar kli sharis shalom midas. So Chizkiya holds that a sakin is just like any other kli sharis. It is mekadesh shalom midas, or lo mekadesh hol vein lo toch. Maybe it's not mekadesh because it doesn't have an inside, or alima mi kli sharis. Maybe it's stronger than kli sharis. Do'ain lo toch. Why is it stronger? Because it doesn't have an inside. Umekachi, it still sanctifies. Hilkach alima nami lahai milsa shemekadesh shalom midas. Therefore, it's stronger also in this regard that it is mekadesh shalom midas. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, Shachta chutz lezmana v'chutz lemekoma. Let's say he slaughters it outside of the proper time. That means with intention outside the proper time, or outside of the proper place. Again, with intention outside of the proper place. So this is talking about slaughtering the carbon toda with either an intention of pigul, that's chutz lezmana, or just an intention of chutz lemekoma, which would disqualify the carbon. So then kadosh alechem. So in such a situation, the bread is sanctified. And the idea over here is that if the animal is pigul, the bread will also be pigul. If the animal is just disqualified as a carbon, so then the bread too will be disqualified. It will be sanctified but disqualified. And the Mishnah continues, Shachta v'nimtzas treifa. Let's say he slaughters the animal, again the carbon toda, and it turns out that the animal's a treifa. So then lo kiddush alechem. So then the bread is not going to be sanctified. Shachta v'nimtzas balas mum. Let's say he slaughters the animal and he finds out that it has a blemish. Rabbi Eliezer omer kiddush. Rabbi Eliezer says that the bread is sanctified in that case. V'chachamim omrim lo kiddush, and the chachamim say it is not sanctified. And the Mishnah continues, Shachta shalo lishma. Let's say he slaughters it, but not for its sake. V'chein el hamiluim. The same would be true by the ram, which is a shlomim by the miluim, by the time of the inauguration of the Mishkan. We would say the same thing over there. And also, v'chein shnei kivsei atzeres. And also, the same is going to be true by the two communal shlomim. That's talking about the two communal shlomim lambs of Shavuos. If they also, shashachtan shalo lishman, if they were slaughtered not for their sake, so then again, lo kadosh alechem, then the bread is not going to be kadosh. The bread is not going to be sanctified. And Rashi Ksaviyat explains, Shachtal manas lach lechutz lizmana. Let's say he slaughters it with the intention to eat it outside the proper time. Kodash alechem v'nifkal. So again, the bread is going to be sanctified, but it will be pigul. Al manas lach lechutz lemekom. If it's in order to eat it outside of the proper place, Kodash alechem v'nifsal. So then the bread will be sanctified and disqualified. The psula b'kodesh. The point over here is that the disqualification took place in the kodesh. It took place because it was slaughtered with the wrong intention. V'kaimalan bizvachim kol shepsula b'kodesh. We establish in Mesechet Zvachim, anytime the disqualification takes place in the Kodesh, HaKodesh Mekablo, so the Kodesh accepts it, so to speak. Beperak HaMizbeach Mekadesh, that's in Perak HaMizbeach Mekadesh. Shachta v'nimtzas treifa lo kiddush alechem. Now, if it turns out to be a treifa, the bread is not sanctified, because there, the psulo kodem shchita, who there the disqualification took place really before the shchita, before the slaughtering, it was already a treifa, it was already puzzle. Now, Shachta v'nimtzas balas mum, what about balas mum? That would seem to be the same as treifa, but here we have a machlokas tanoim. Rabbi Eliezer omer kiddush. Rabbi Eliezer says it's kadosh. Now, why would Rabbi Eliezer say kadosh if by treifa it's lo kiddush? So Rashi explains, mukminan la begemara bedukin sheba'ayin. In the Gemara, we're going to say this is talking about a small blemish, let's say the cornea of the eye, not a major blemish. V'yaliba de Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Eliezer follows the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. Diamarim alu lo yerdu. Rabbi Akiva says that in such a case, if it goes up on the mizbeach, it doesn't come down, and that's why it's kiddush alechem. This is beperak hamizbeach mekadesh, and perak hamizbeach mekadesh. And finally, shalo lishma. It said at the end of the Mishnah, if one slaughtered shalo lishma, and this would be true by the el hamiluim, and would be true by the shnei kivsei atzeres as well. So lo kiddush alechem, shalo lishma lo kiddush mefarsh begemara zevach toda. It says zevach toda melamid shem shachta shalo lishma. That pasuk of zevach toda teaches us. We had this earlier. Shem shachta shalo lishma lo kiddush alechem. That if he slaughters it shalo lishma, then the bread is not going to be sanctified. And the Gemara says, Masnisan money. Now, who is the author of our Mishnah? Rabbi Meir, the author of our Mishnah is Rabbi Meir. The Tanya, because we learn in a Brayso, says, Zahaklal, this is the rule. Kol shepisulo kodem shchita, if the disqualification took place before shchita, like Rashi just mentioned, lo kiddush alechem, so then the bread is not going to be sanctified. But pisulo achar shchita, but if the disqualification is after the slaughtering, so then kiddush alechem, so then the bread is going to be sanctified. Shachta chutz lezmana v'chutz lemekoma, if it's slaughtered outside the proper time, with that kind of intention, or with intention outside the proper place, kiddush alechem, then the bread is sanctified. Shachta v'nim says treifa lo kiddush alechem, if it's slaughtered, it turns out to be a treifa, then the lechem is not going to be sanctified. And Rashi Ksaviat explains, Kol shepesulo kodem shchita shachta al menas la'achla, if he slaughters it with the intention to eat it chutz lezmana, chutz lemekoma, outside the proper time or place, lo have pisulo kodem shchita, there the disqualification was not before shchita, but treifa have pisulo kodem shchita, but by treifa the disqualification is before shchita, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Ayin Tes Amud Aleph.